Excellent. Okay, we have slides. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, good, good. Oh, the lights came up. Now I can't see anyone. Excellent music coming in, by the way. Does anyone remember which movie that was played in? I'm kind of a movie buff, and music buff and history buff all rolled into one. Does anyone remember? Tron Legacy? Anybody? Bueller? Okay, never mind. Anyway, welcome to this morning's session on This Stuff is Cool, but how can I get my company to do it? Or as I like to call it, businessing the S out of transformative development. My name is Mark Heckler. I am a principal technologist and developer advocate with Pivotal Software, Inc. Pivotal is the maker of Spring Boot, Spring Framework, Redis, RabbitMQ, Greenplum, huge contributor to Cloud Foundry through the Cloud Foundry Foundation, as well as a huge contributor to Apache Tomcat. We like to refer to ourselves as a tiny little startup in Silicon Valley. I blog semi-regularly at thehecklers.org, my personal domain. But I tweet all the time. I kind of live on Twitter at mkheck. Is anyone here on Twitter? Okay, a few of you. Just a couple. I am also on the slightly older and more established social network called Email. So if anybody here on Email? Couple? Okay, that's good. I always say that we have a really short time together here to talk about this or any topic. So it's just enough time to kind of get the conversation started. It's really not enough time to do a lot with it, just to kind of get things going. So the infinite amount of time afterward is far more productive in many ways. So please do reach out to me. If I hit something too quickly, if I gloss over something you thought maybe should have been touched upon or maybe treated more fully, that's fine. Maybe I felt that way too. Let me know, and I would be happy to discuss at length anything. So with that, let's get started. So who am I? Well, I am the author of several blogs and blog posts. I have co-authored one book. I have another in the pipeline. And I've contributed to several others, both code and text. I love to read. I love to write. I love to share. I always feel like the more we all share, the faster we all grow, which seems like a huge plus to me. I've spoken around the world on various development-centered topics. Thank you for inviting me here. This place is amazing, isn't it? And just to be able to speak in the Tesla room is kind of geeking me out, so I'm loving this. First and foremost, I'm a developer. I've worked for various consultancies over the years. I've worked for Oracle. I have the scars to prove it. But I hang my virtual hat at Pivotal now, and I'm very happy to do that. I use what works, and when I identify gaps, I try to fill those gaps. I love open source. I feel like it is the method, the approach of the present and the future, the model of the present and the future. There are exceptions, but I'm firmly of the mind that they are exceptions. And I'm always looking for a better way to deploy real software to production, not undifferentiated heavy lifting, as Adrian Cockcroft, formerly of Netflix, likes to say. And finally, I'm an MBA. Business and engineering are not disciplines that are entirely at odds with each other. I wasn't a big fan of marketing or management studies, but statistics, economics, finance, I absolutely love it. And chances are, if you're an analytical person, you will love those elements as well. So, listening to me try to speak Serbian is kind of like this. Does anyone recognize this, by the way? It's hard to hear over the crowd, but yep. Yes, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This is a Vogon. Hearing Vogons recite poetry is horrible. Okay, I'm getting a few smiles, so obviously some people are in the know. If not, go watch this movie, or better yet, read the books. But I'm not going to subject you to listening to me try horribly and failing horribly to speak Serbian, so it's all in English. You're welcome. So, most talks at tech conferences are tech talks. And most of my talks at tech conferences are tech talks. This one is different. This is a talk that's a little off the beaten path. Hopefully you'll find it helpful. I always kind of can appreciate the fact that we go to tech conferences, we learn a lot of things that are extremely helpful or could be extremely helpful to our environment, our circumstances. And then we go back to our company and we kind of hit that wall because our leadership doesn't necessarily always see the same things that we saw when we heard about them firsthand, and it's very difficult to convey the advantages or the opportunities that some of those opportunities imply. So I always feel like this is a really critically important talk. It's also the only talk that I give where I don't fire up my IDE. So it's a little different for me too, but I really do geek out on this. Hopefully you'll get something out of it. If you came to see me live code, this isn't that one of those talks, so save yourself now. But I do think this is very valuable to discuss. So, by the way, you recognize the Monty Python, right? I don't have, okay, all right. So the goal today is to stay as close to a purely fact-based discussion as possible. I hate straw men. I really don't like it when people set up an easy argument, destroy it, and claim victory. I try to flesh out fully the numbers and to create and expose good case studies. So that's what I'll be trying to do. If anyone's looking for something to disagree with, I'm sure I'll provide that. But I have reasons for everything I say. Please do ask me. I'd happily discuss it. Assumptions form the basis of many things. And if there's a bad assumption in there, let me know. Happy to adjust that as well. So a little bit of TV and movie history. This is from an old TV show from the 60s. It plays on retro TV in the US. It's kind of painful to watch, to be honest with you, some of the old stuff, but it's always kind of fun because, again, I'm a history buff. So, okay, some disclaimers. First of all, I'm human. So again, I may need to tweak some of the things that I talk about. If something doesn't sound quite right, ask me. I probably have reasons for it. If I don't, I'll fix it. Another disclaimer is that measurements require assumptions. What we're going to be talking about is taking qualitative measures and making them into quantitative measures. That is a difficult thing, even in the best of circumstances. So it's something that's uncomfortable. It's something that's difficult. It's something that's not automatable. But we'll work through that. Assumptions will be clearly stated and quantified. This is a very important thing, to clearly state your assumptions so that they can be challenged, they can be tweaked and improved. Always estimate benefits conservatively and costs liberally. You don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. And of course, the numbers you see are examples. Please, please, please do not take numbers that I'm throwing out and apply them exactly to every case. They're very unique to each individual case that you may run into. So please take them, use them as a foundation, but create your own numbers based upon sound circumstances that you are encountering at that point in time. So again, adjust sensibly for your circumstances. Kind of got ahead of that one. Remember, with great power, yes, with great power comes great responsibility. Spider-Man 2002. This is important. The goal of this is not to bend your leadership to your will, to justify a bad initiative. It's to create a solid foundation, a solid justification for a good initiative. And that's what we're talking about here. Not making stuff up, but fully understanding and analyzing what is there in the first place, or disproving what may have been a bad initiative that you may have embarked upon. So, what's on the agenda? Well, let me first say that this single slide contains the sum total of all knowledge in the world. So this is usually what we talk about in Tech Talks, what they don't teach you at Harvard Business School. Today I'm going to be focusing more on this side, kind of the business aspects, the financial aspects. They're absolutely critical to your project's acceptance and success. So, the first thing we'll talk about is a term called payback, a measure called payback. That's a very good measure used in financial circles, in justifications, in analyses, but it's not a complete measure, as we'll see. Then we'll discuss net present value, or as it's sometimes referred to as NPV, and why that's actually a much better measure. I like it really well. There are other measures as well, which I'll kind of briefly touch on, but these are the two that I focus on the most. We'll discuss quantification, how to take squishy inputs or qualitative inputs and turn them into quantitative outputs. We'll also, in order to do that, we'll base them upon solid, well-reasoned, and calculated assumptions. These are things that you need to fully document and explore and refine as you go so that you don't have a garbage in, garbage out type of scenario. There are a lot of steps to go through, but don't panic. Right? Okay, good. I'm seeing recognition on the, so this is good, yeah. All right, so let's start with payback. The formula for payback, or payback period, goes something like this. You take the cost of the project in its whole, divide by the annual cash inflow, or the savings that result from an initiative, and that determines your payback period. An example usually helps. So if you have a new project that, or a new initiative that has costs, total costs of $500,000 or euros or dinars or whatever you want to use in your circumstances as they are. If you have $500,000 in new costs and you have $200,000 in new income each year, that results in a payback period of 2.5 years. Makes sense, right? 500,000 divided by 200,000, 2.5 years. Not bad. So, to explore this a little bit, well, a shorter payback period is generally better. It's more liquid. The money is freed sooner for other investments because you have typically in any company a certain amount of money that can be applied to any different investments, and all your investments compete. So the sooner you can retrieve that or get that money back, the sooner you can reinvest it in another initiative. A longer payback typically means more uncertainty and greater risk because while you're doing this initiative, market conditions don't stay the same. They change. Interest rates change. The competitive landscape changes. Your competitors aren't just standing still. They're moving too. They're doing things as well. So the longer the payback is, the less certainty you're dealing with. Typically, a 3-year or under payback period is preferred because once you get past that, it gets a lot sketchier. And a payback period of under 1 year is generally considered an essential project. If you can get your money back out of an initiative within a year's time, that's usually just a green light. So some of the drawbacks. Well, first of all, there's no consideration of total value. You're just concerned about getting your money back. And as the old saying goes, sometimes I'm not so much concerned about the return on my capital as the return of my capital. That's what payback is. But it doesn't take into consideration the total value. For instance, if you had 2 competing initiatives, one of which offered a 3-year payback, you get your money back within 3 years' time. But there's no further value realized after year 5, and it has a lifetime value of $250,000. And up against that, in consideration, is a project with a 5-year payback, with ongoing value, with a lifetime value of $1 million. Payback doesn't address any of that. It doesn't consider the total value. It just considers how quickly you get your money back. And in that regard, the first option is better, right? Which would you choose? Well, there are many factors to consider. The faster payback versus the better expected overall return, the greater uncertainty for the longer project. All these things are real factors that factor into your financial folks' decisions on which way to invest. There's also no consideration of the time value of money, which is the worth in constant dollars. How do you determine the time value of money? Well, if I offered you 1,000 dinar today, or 1,000 dinar 10 years from now, which would you choose? Well, that's easy, right? Today. Today's always better. If it's the same amount of money, you know that in today's dollars or dinars, it's 1,000. Down the road, it may be much less because inflation, circumstances. I mean, it just, again, now is always better. It's always worth more the sooner you get it. So we want to factor that in, and payback just doesn't do that. It's a good measure, but it's an incomplete measure. So what's better? Well, there's a measure called internal rate of return, IRR. That's a good measure, but net present value is better, and I'll explain why in just a moment. Net present value, the formula for NPV is to take the sum of the net period cash flows, divide that by 1 plus R to the power of T, where R is the rate of return, and T is the number of time periods. And as you can see from the formula, you can adjust those with each time period. And the time periods are adjustable too, whether it's a year or 6 months or a quarter or month or week. However, your circumstances dictate that can change. And that results in your NPV. The huge limitation with the internal rate of return is that it uses one single discount rate to evaluate every investment over the entire time frame. NPV is much more flexible. So let's go into a couple examples. The first example, if you have $1 million in net cash flow and you divide that by 1 plus 0.05 to the 5th power, so that means your rate of return is 5%, and T, your time periods are 5. We'll say it's 5 years in this case. That results in a net present value in today's constant dollars of $783,526. So it looks like $1 million. It's really $750,000 by the time it's all said and done. Still good. Still nothing to sneeze at, right? So to break this out a little bit more, if we have a 3-year project, and over time, of course, we're projecting our income, our net cash flows to increase. So the first year, we're ramping up. We may have a net cash flow of $100,000. The second, $200,000. The third, $400,000. And let's just say our costs of borrowing go down. So the first year, we're looking at a 5% cost of capital. The second year, 4%. The third year, 3%. This is mainly to show you that you can adjust these things as needed through NPV. That comes up with a total after 3 years in today's dollars of $646,206. Make sense? Okay. So some of the inputs and associated challenges. Well, first, any kind of financial analysis, the big one is it's tough to quantify qualitative measures. You need to incorporate your positive and negative impacts, your offsetting impacts. Everything possible should be considered and factored into the equation. That's not easy to do. For instance, you have to consider and state clearly how this change would affect your organizations or your groups or your team's work. How would this initiative improve your ability to go to market, to deliver functionality faster, better functionality that more closely reflects what your users are requesting and needing? How would it impact your tech stack? Because there will be costs involved when you change, when you take on an initiative, when you change your tech stack. How would it contribute to recruitment and retention? Has anyone here intentionally sought out a company that's using 10 or 20-year-old technology? Oh, come on. Probably not, right? I mean, it's a lot easier to recruit quality people when you're dealing with current technology, when you're pressing against the edges. It's something that people want to be a part of and want to take part in. So anytime you take on a new initiative, it has the potential to make your company, your team, a lot more attractive to talent and to perhaps keep the talent that you have a lot better. That's something that's difficult to quantify, but it's certainly a factor that goes into it. Also, how would it affect the business? Because with any initiative, it's going to make some changes to the way you do business, positive and negative, and these are things that you need to take into account as well. So, some of the pros and cons with putting numbers to things. Well, first of all, a critical analysis yields better understanding of inputs and impacts. Again, the goal of this is not to make it easy to justify a bad project. It's to understand what goes into your initiative that you're considering and the good and the bad and see if it makes sense. And if it does, to state clearly how that makes sense and why for your organization. This can provide more objective and compelling justification for initiative rather than go to your leadership and saying, this is cool. All the cool kids are doing this. You can actually go and say, this should help our organization in these material ways. Here's why, here's how much, here are my projections. Tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me how we can adjust this and make it better, how we can increase the fidelity. And that creates an entirely different discussion. The cons are that this can be very time-consuming. I mean, literally, you could spend the rest of your life trying to quantify qualitative measures for a single initiative. It's tough. And again, there's no easy automated way to do that. So, some caveats. Well, first of all, time is a constraint because we can't just do that forever. We have to time box that. We have to come up with a certain amount of time that we can analyze our inputs, come up with some outputs, and move on. The world keeps moving, right? So assumptions form the basis of all conclusions. Bad assumptions will lead to inaccurate conclusions. Good assumptions can also lead to inaccurate conclusions if you don't fully flesh them out. The key to a solid analysis is to make supportable assumptions and document them meticulously so that they can be discussed, refined, and reconsidered. The more you document your assumptions up front, the easier it is for your financial people to take pot shots at them, to tell you where you're wrong, to tell you how to make them better. That is a good thing, right? So let's run through it. Suit is optional. I did want to tell you, I kind of skipped over this. I always try to dress appropriately for my talks. And since this is a financial talk, I wanted to dress in a way that bespeaks wealth and power, right? So I wore my Wayne Enterprises shirt. I hope you appreciate that. I don't typically wear suits, so this is as good as it gets. So, all right. The thing that I wanted to discuss as far as a project or an initiative to evaluate is microservices, migrating to a microservices architecture. Why that? Well, I've actually had a lot of people ask me, why don't you do something else? Why don't you do something a little more concrete? Have you ever thought about doing a talk on how it makes sense to migrate to a cloud environment? Yes, I have. I also have numbers. I've collected the numbers for that. But I work for Pivotal, and Pivotal sells a cloud environment. I don't want this to come off as a sales talk. If you're interested in those numbers, I'll happily share them with you. But the idea here is to talk about the mechanics, figuring out the numbers, analyzing projects, not to sell you anything. So again, if you're interested in that, see me offline. But this is really something, and to be honest with you, this is tougher. This is a lot tougher to analyze something that's a little less quantitative in and of itself. So let's tackle the tough stuff, right? Don't shy away from that. So microservices architectures. Let's take a look at that. So some notes about microservices. Well, first, the return on investment typically is driven by accelerated realization of benefits rather than overall business transformation. I kind of touch on both, but I do want to focus on that as we go through. Typically, studies have shown there are reduced maintenance costs overall. Several studies. I have references. Please see me afterward if you're interested. There are typically increased business opportunities through new APIs. Not always, but there can be. Has anyone heard of a tiny company called Amazon.com? A couple of you. Okay, that's good. Amazon started down the microservices path, not intending to expose them in any way to customers. They wanted to increase the reusability of key components, services that are offered within Amazon to Amazon. Over time, of course, that became very much easier to expose them to partners and to customers. And now we have what's called Amazon Web Services. Did you know that last year was the first year that Amazon Web Services made more money than all of the other business units within Amazon combined? Amazon is not a retailer. It's not a bookseller. It is a cloud provider. It does all that other stuff, I think, for fun. But this is what APIs can do for you. So potentially increased business opportunities through new APIs. Yes. Selective scaling of only high-demand microservices reduces costs. Because rather than try to duplicate your entire system every time you need to scale, you scale what needs to be scaled at that point in time. And it gives you scale out, scale in very, very quickly and easily. We do recognize, however, in this analysis, that investment includes upskilling, coaching, mentoring. Nothing comes for free. So you're going to need to invest in any initiative to get anything out. So we're going to take those costs into consideration as well. So certain expectations that we have. Well, with microservices, small batch sizes typically imply smaller teams. They also typically, in order to develop good microservices, you have what's called bounded contexts. You scope things down. You have single responsibilities. Microservice should handle, and I always think this is kind of ironic, it should do one thing and do it well. Do one thing, do it well. But okay, anyway. Is anyone here familiar with Dr. Eric Evans and domain-driven design? With microservices, excellent. With microservices, typically you scope things down. So you have a microservice that provides one key, what I call nugget of functionality. And again, that allows you certain things like scaling and things like that. API-based contracts for interactions, that enforces a certain degree of cohesion and it reduces your coupling. I talk about that a little bit more later. More functionality is typically delivered to market or internal end users sooner. Again, lots of studies behind that. Don't take my word for it. Research it as well. And building the right product. With a microservices approach, typically you can develop an entire microservice or group of related microservices very quickly. You're typically dealing with the same subject matter experts throughout the development cycle, and that typically means that you can come a lot closer to the set of requirements than you would if you had a 12 to 18-month release cycle. So, again, expectations. Well, we typically see improved quality. These are things that we're going to try to analyze and assign numbers to. Improved quality due to small modifications versus major overhauls. Improved end user satisfaction because you can deliver functionality that's closer to what they requested sooner and do it better. Small frequent releases expose and help resolve process issues in the small. Again, ties back to releasing more quickly and dealing with the same consistent set of inputs. And when releases are tiny, well-planned and choreographed events, they can happen at will. You can make releases a lot faster. So, as opposed to what? Well, let's consider this as opposed to monolithic architectures. So, as I say, that's one big app. Godzilla, anyone? Right? So some assumptions. For monoliths, the average cadence of releases, we're going to say, is about 1 per year. Is anyone here working on a monolith? Okay. Let me just ask this. Are you on a 12-plus month release cycle? Anyone? No honest people in the room? Okay, we got one honest guy right here. Okay. Okay, 6 to 12 month release cycle? 3 to 6? Okay, let's go. Under 3? A few. All right. Typically, especially when you're dealing with larger companies and larger applications, you typically see somewhere, or at least a lot of times, very frequently, 12 to 18-month release cycle, not uncommon at all. I keep it at 12 because it makes the math simple, but adjust to your circumstances, please. So with a 12-month release cycle assumed, typically it goes something like this. 10 months of development before some kind of a code freeze, about a month of integration testing and bug fixes, about a month of user acceptance tests, which typically involve confirmations, course corrections, logging new requirements, which often are the same requirements you just missed the mark on. So this is what we're kind of assuming for our analysis. As opposed to microservices, some of the assumptions that we're going to be considering, the average cadence of microservice releases are somewhere along the lines of 7,448 per day, which always gets a little bit of a shock from folks here. So where did I get the numbers, right? Well, right here. Amazon released its information in 2001 that said about every 11.6 seconds, they release a new or updated microservice. So we're not all Amazon, I get that. But if your company is 1/1000th as effective as Amazon was in 2011, 5 years ago, that's still over 7 releases a day. So if you're only 0.1% as effective as Amazon was 5 years before, you can still have over 7 releases a day. That's not bad. So that's over 2,500 releases per year, as opposed to 1, right? So that means if we assume that we can create 14 new microservices in the first year, if we can really buckle down and get busy and come up with a whopping 14 new microservices by the end of 12 months, each of your year 1 microservices could average a release of once every other day. 7 per day, 14 microservices, that's 1 every 2 days. So, how much more functionality can be delivered more quickly or more accurately to your users? These are things that we'll try to quantify to the extent possible, again, based upon solid, well-documented assumptions. If you could approach 0 with missed requirements, or missed opportunities, missed expectations, how much is that worth? Typically quite a lot. And if users can have needed functionality months or even years sooner, what's that worth to your company? Quite a bit. So our job is to somehow put together the numbers for that and show that. Picture a few instances of volatile functionality within your company, things your end users are demanding that you've not been able to fulfill quickly. If you're in a financial field, perhaps your brokers or your agents or your bank locations have been asking for certain new functionality. If you're in the auto industry, perhaps your dealers or customers. It can be either systems driven or with systems supporting them. If we focus upon producing key abilities, so the 14 microservices that we mentioned before are kind of an excellent toehold, we can expect to be able to define interfaces, likely REST APIs, in our monoliths for interoperability. So for our figures, we're going to assume 6 months to get those APIs live. Why 6 months? Because if we have a 12-month release cycle for our monolith, you cut that in half to get an average. That's all. I assumed an average business size of roughly 500 million in annual revenue. The reason I did that is because I wanted to estimate low. That is, 500,000 is the median mid-sized US business for my numbers. The preponderance of projects of this significant scope would probably be that or larger. So again, estimate conservatively. And the estimated impact of highly volatile, high-demand projects to be implemented via microservices, I actually apportioned a portion of the net revenue to each microservice. You don't have to do that. I just find it works out really, makes it easier to calculate and visualize. So I attributed a certain amount per microservice. 14 new microservices for an initiative of 14 million is about 1 million per microservice. So there will be costs involved. We know there will be upskilling for the relevant tech teams. We know we're going to have to invest in training and expanding a skill set. We're going to assume in the first year we're going to invest $1 million in our people. That makes sense, right? There will be ramp up. We know that there will be certain costs associated with a new initiative. I typically see those offset by avoidance of contextualization issues in the circumstances of monoliths versus microservices. Because when you expand on a monolith, you have a lot to get your arms around. So you have a lot of testing to make sure that you don't have unanticipated impacts in other areas that aren't related to the area you're expanding upon. We avoid many of those with a microservices approach. I'm calling that a wash. But again, in a full analysis, you'd probably document both, even if they do come out the same. And then other things that may smooth or speed the path. I've omitted those. I think they make actually a stronger case, but again, that gets into a lot more time. We don't have it. Moving on. There will be platform costs and interface development. So whether you're making offsetting acquisitions for a platform, for a new cloud platform, or expanding your existing footprint in-house, you assume that if you're taking on a new initiative, there will be additional costs for your systems. Those are factored in. I'm actually plugging in a kind of a high number at 2 million, but better again to estimate your costs high. And then you assume that if you didn't take on this new architectural approach, you would still implement some new functionality. We also recognize that dealing with a monolith is going to be a little bit slower going. So out of the 14 million, we assume that we could still implement at least 5 million of that through our existing mechanisms. We're not going to take credit for that. We would do that anyway. So we use that to offset what we could potentially gain for a net gain. Which comes out with these numbers at the end of the projections. So at the end of year one, we project new revenues of 14 million for this new initiative. We know there'll be $1 million in upskilling, we estimate. We estimate an additional $1 million in platform costs, an additional $1 million of defining interfaces for our monoliths, and opportunity costs of $5 million, which results in a net gain of 6 million at the end of year one. That's our projection. So if we plug that into our original numbers, our original formula for payback, we take the cost of the project, which is estimated to be 8 million. We divide that by 14 million, which is our net new revenues, and it comes out to a payback of 6.86 months. Approved, right? Less than a year, it's a go. But not so fast. Because remember, I said that's an incomplete measure. So let's really flesh this out. And I'll go through this a little faster because I don't want to pain you guys too much. But again, just to review, 14 million new revenues, 8 million in new costs, a year one net gain of 6 million. So let's plug this in, or actually let's take this a step further, and we'll go with our year two and year three assumptions. For year two, we assume that we're getting a little better at this as we go. So 14 microservices is really a horribly tiny number of microservices. It always dismays me a little bit when I hear people talk, sometimes very, very well-known people talk about a microservices architecture and having delivered a lot of new functionality with 5 new microservices. That's not a microservices architecture. That's a toy or a really good start. Netflix, for their main Netflix.com page, feeds that whole single pane of glass with a series of microservices, roughly about 500 of them. That's a system, okay? So again, we're estimating really low. The first year we estimate we can only come up with 14. Let's double that for year 2 because we're getting a little better at this. We're assigning a few new resources to it. So if we can assume by the end of year 2, we add an additional 28 microservices to our efforts. Comes up with 42 by the end of year 2. We're going to estimate a slightly reduced impact, which is probably overly pessimistic. Have any of you, when you've developed and delivered new functionality to users, had them say, okay, that's enough, I don't want anything new ever again, this is great, we're done? No, they come up with new ideas. And as soon as you prove that you can deliver better stuff faster, what do? They get greedy, right? I mean, we all do it, we're human. So when you show them that you can deliver real functionality to them quickly, they come up with better ideas and more productive and more opportunities for your company. But I'm going to assume that doesn't happen because I'm going to be a pessimist. So we'll assume that the impact is reduced. Let's say we're only going to realize a benefit of $750,000 for each new microservice, which comes up with an additional $21 million in new revenue. Add that to our 14 for $35 million in new revenue by the end of year 2. Again, pessimistic numbers. We'll also assume optimistically that we can expand our monolith in a linear fashion. Add 5 million more of new capability by the end of year 2 to our monolith. That's tough to do because our monolith, if we were to do that, would continue to expand, which slows you down, right? But again, we'll be generous. We'll assume that we could do that otherwise. So we assume that 10 million by end of year 2 could have been implemented in our monolith of new functionality. We won't take credit for that. So at the end of year 2, the totals are new revenues of 35 million. Upskilling, we're going to continue to invest in our people. Platform costs, we're going to assume, are still going to be there, more platform. Interfaces, we're going to add onto our monolith so we can deal with our monolith and exchange information with. Opportunity costs, again, the functionality we would have implemented in the monolith anyway, for a net gain of 21 million at the end of year 2. Year 3, we're going to continue the trend. We're going to get a little better at this. We're going to tackle a few new projects, and we're going to assume that we can deliver 56 new microservices by the end of year 3. 14, 28, 56. We're increasing this as we go. So by the end of year 3, we have 98 new microservices. Again, we'll be pessimists and assume that our impact will be reduced further, 500,000 per microservice. Comes up with 35 million in new, or excuse me, 28 million in new revenue. Add that to the 35 that we're still realizing off of our year 1 and 2 microservices for the new initiative. Is 63 million in new revenue by the end of year 3. Again, we credit the monolith with the ability to expand in a linear fashion. Probably unrealistic, but we'll go with it. So 15 million worth of functionality would have been implemented in the monolith anyway. I'm not taking credit for that. Let's run the numbers. End of year 3, 63 million in new revenue. Upskilling, again, investing in our people, expanding our teams, right? New platform costs, we're going to increase that dramatically. Again, these are crazy numbers. I'm still going with them, even though they're high. Interfaces of another million, opportunity costs, 15, for a net gain by end of year 3 of $40 million per our projections. So we'll plug in the numbers to our NPV formula. 6 million in new revenues the first year, or net new revenues. Divide that by 1.05, which is our cost of borrowing, or opportunity cost for our capital. 21 million the second year, 40 million the third. We assume a constant rate of borrowing for a total of $61,086,277 in net present value for this particular initiative. Right? Go big or go home. So, to revisit really quickly the factors. First, with any kind of financial analysis, you're going to have to quantify qualitative measures. That's difficult. It's challenging. It's open to being challenged. That's good. You have to document certain things. How would it affect your organizations or your groups or your team's work? How would it impact your tech stack? How would it contribute to recruitment or retention for your organization? And how would it affect the business as a whole? How would it open up opportunities for your company? How would it pose challenges for your company? These are all things that you have to capture somehow and quantify somehow. That's tough, but you have the tools to do it. So, in summary, a critical analysis yields a better understanding of inputs and impacts. This is good. Again, the idea is not to justify a bad initiative, it's to understand your initiative, and if it's a good one, to be able to clearly articulate why it's a good one. and hopefully get approval for that to move out with it. Can provide more objective and compelling justification. The goal is not to justify, the goal is to be honest. Document and communicate your assumptions clearly. This changes the whole discussion. You're not talking about a technology, you're talking about an initiative that can make a difference for your company in survivability or market positioning. This is important stuff, and this can actually help you take on the initiatives that you know are key to your company's survival and to being able to thrive, but it's hard to articulate when you just come back and talk about cloud or containers or whatever. Be open to course corrections, because when you get course corrections, it makes your numbers that much more robust, that much more accurate. So remember, this is not the enemy. Without the financial folks, your company would not survive. If your company doesn't survive, you don't get a paycheck. And frankly, a little bit further out, nobody wants to be associated with something that died, right? I mean, you want your company to succeed. It's good to contribute to something meaningful that has longevity, and that's what we all want to be a part of. These are not the enemies, these are our allies. So it's time to bring them over to our side and to go to theirs and to work with them on their terms so that we can show them what they need to see to help us justify the important initiatives that we know are key for our company. So that's kind of all I have today. Keep the conversation going. Please reach out to me on Twitter or via email. Always happy to discuss this stuff at length. Great lengths. So that's it for now. Any questions? We have a couple minutes here left. Yes, sir.
Monolith design. And you've been doing a monolith design for, let's say, a year or two or whatever. Won't you have a tighter confidence intervals in knowing what your costs and what your profits are likely to be with the one instead of the microservices, which are, you know, unknown with greater confidence intervals?
Okay, well, I was going to say, I started to repeat the question, but everybody heard that, so that's great. It is something you have to take into account, and that's something that plays in as well, because the fact that you have a certain familiarity should not be discounted. I will say that if you have been working with a monolith a fairly short amount of time, typically that means it's a smaller monolith, which is not a bad thing. It's a lot easier to reason about a monolith when it's still small enough to get your arms around. You sometimes see them called baby monoliths. The thing that I always kind of caution people is that, and probably this has not happened to anybody here, but have you ever developed a monolithic system, a monolithic application, only to, and been told this will be have a user base of 50 to 100 people, only to have your company acquire another company or be acquired and then be told it's rolling out to 3 locations with 1,000 users? Never happened to anybody here, right? So even in a monolithic environment where you have a lot of certainty, a lot of times that becomes very uncertain. Inherently, it's not that scalable. The reason being is to scale a monolith, you have to scale every bit of functionality in it, duplicate the entire thing. So it's certainly something to take into account and to factor that in as a plus, frankly, for the monolith. But it's something also to recognize that is more volatile, it's more subject to change. And that, again, it's one of those qualitative measures that's tough to quantify. Any other? Yes?
Okay. So, quick question. What if you're having a monolith that runs on bare hardware and then you're fully switching to cloud and microservices? So what would your transition be? Like switch from monolith bare bones to cloud and then switch to microservices, or like do it all together?
Okay. If I'm understanding what you're asking, it's do you do a staged migration or do you do kind of a all or nothing? I will say, okay, good. I will say this, my goal wasn't necessarily to advocate specifically for that. I use that as a case study. However, I am a convert to microservices. I'll happily answer that. Typically with a microservices approach, you don't get the full benefit from that unless you have a certain level of tooling support, the ability to continuously integrate and continuously deploy. So there are certain things that are kind of implied with that. It's not that you can't do that with your existing processes and systems. It's just that most of the time our current systems aren't built along those lines to that level. So you can break it out, but I think you get the most bang for your buck by assuming a migration at the same time. We okay? We done? I don't want to run long, but I don't want to cut anybody off. Maybe one more? Okay. I tell you what, we'll go ahead and let everybody go, and if anybody has any questions, come see me, or again, ping me. I'm on Twitter. I'm actually much faster to respond on Twitter than email, but I do respond to everything. So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it, and thanks. Have a great day.